So today we are going to be in our 5th week of our Wonderful Women in the Bible series. Today we get to look at a woman who was able to be in a position, a different role than any other woman we've looked at so far, and to be honest, a different role, different position than any woman we're going to look at later on in this series. In this 13-week series, we are looking at 13 different women that God used in a specific place, a specific time, and for a specific purpose. But none of these others will be in the position that this woman is today. Today we get to look at Deborah, the woman with power. It's a time when a woman's testimony was often not considered valid in court. It was a time where women were clearly perceived as a lower value than men. It's no doubt a time where women worked hard. They worked their tails off. But it was clearly the man of the house who ran the house. It was during a time like this that a woman named Deborah rose to power. It's a fascinating story that we read about in the book of Judges that we're going to look at today. But before we get into looking at the story of Deborah from Judges chapter 4, we've got to first look at what is going on in Israel. So for the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at the history leading up to Deborah. And when we do this, it makes me ask myself this question: what was Israel thinking? And I ask that because for a couple of reasons. Because at this time, we got to see what's going on. Judges follows the book of Joshua. Judges is the 6th book in the Bible. In Joshua, we read about where God gave the land, the promised land, that land of Canaan, to the Israelites because he had promised to give it to Abraham's descendants, these people. So the Israelites go in there in the book of Joshua and they're supposed to wipe out all of the Canaanites because they were a very wicked, evil people. As I said last week, God just did not want these Israelites living among the Canaanite people because they would eventually start living like them and following and serving their false gods. And so Joshua was the one to lead the Israelites into these battles, taking over these cities, this land. And in the last chapter of Joshua, we can read about some of Joshua's final words, really, to these people, to the nation of Israel. So I want to share those kind of to set this scene before we get into Judges. Joshua 24, verses 14 and 15 has Joshua saying this: "Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Some of the most famous words from Joshua right there, that last sentence: "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." You know, this is around the end of Joshua's life, before he would die at the age of 110. And he's basically giving these people this ultimatum, you could say right here. He knows of the false gods that their fathers, their ancestors had worshipped in the past years when they were on the other side of the Jordan River, when they were slaves in Egypt. And I've read that the book of Joshua, the time frame of it, covers anywhere from 20 to 40 years, period. And most people believe it's closer to that 20 years. So let's go with 20 years. If that's the case, then in the last 60 years before this Joshua makes this statement, in the previous 60 years, the Israelites have been freed from slavery in Egypt by God, right? By the power of God with those 10 plagues. God had dried up the Red Sea for them to come through, the power of God. They had wandered in the desert for 40 years because of their lack of faith in God. And God still provided for them all the water, all the food that they would need during that 40 years. Then they crossed the Jordan River. They took over the land of Canaan as God had promised them. God fought for them as they fought these battles against larger armies and some fortified cities. All they had to do was wipe out all of these evil Canaanites, just as God instructed. And if they did that, the land would be theirs and they could live in peace. So Joshua gives them these words, basically saying, you have a choice right now. Same thing with us. We always have a choice. And he's looking at them saying, you have a choice to make. Because Joshua is no longer going to be there to lead them after this. They can choose to serve those false gods, but he makes it clear that he and his house, they are going to serve the one true living God. It seems like a no-brainer after seeing and hearing what God had done for them over the last 60 years or so. And it was a no-brainer. So their response to Joshua in that chapter is that they remember all these events. They remember these things that Joshua's talked about. Many of them, some have seen them, some of the people had died off, but they remember these events. And they close out their response to Joshua by saying, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. Just what you would expect. Just what you would hope for. And they did it. These people did it. In the 31st verse of Joshua 24, we read this. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. So while Joshua was alive, they served God. While those elders, those people there who were living with Joshua at that time, while they were alive, they served God. That's exactly what you would expect and what you would hope for. But remember, I said before we get to Deborah, we had to ask ourselves, what was Israel thinking? And I asked that for a reason. Have you ever had a time in life where you felt like you were distant from God? It's not that God left you. It's not that God didn't want anything to do with you, but something changed in you. It happens to most of us, it has. We skip out on church for a while, and our relationship with God, our relationship with his church family becomes weakened, maybe even damaged. We cut out our prayer life, not intending to. Stop reading our Bibles, once again, not intending or not meaning to. And our faith just becomes weaker. Or our faith becomes to a point where we just don't even think about it. Now, I know like you that stuff just doesn't happen, right? I mean, it can't happen because we made a commitment to God. We would be foolish, wouldn't we, to think that way. To think that that doesn't happen sometimes with our faith or that it can't happen to some of us. Because we know all too well that it does happen. And when it does, know this, you're not alone. You're not the only one who has gone through that. And know this, God is always right there waiting to pick us up. We're going to see that today. See, these Israelites, they made a commitment to serve God. And those people that made that commitment, they did so. But Judges, the book of Judges opens up with some interesting stuff. The Israelites are continuing to take over some of the land, some of the cities, including Jerusalem, it talks about. The first chapter of Judges, though, ends by telling us that there were some places that they did not capture. Which means they did not wipe out all of these Canaanites like God had instructed them to do. So God rebukes them, these Israelites. He even tells them that he's not going to drive out these Canaanites. That they're going to live there among them. In fact, God is going to allow these Canaanites, it says in our scripture, that are left in the land to become a thorn in their sides, and their false gods would be a snare to them. So the people of God, that God said this to, the people that God said this to, these are the ones that are committed to serving God. And after Joshua was buried, we read this about that generation that lived with Joshua in Judges 2:10. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. So while Joshua was living, while those people who were living at the same time of Joshua were still alive, they served God. But after that generation of people had died off, it says they did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Think about those words. That generation, they served God. But what happened after them? Another generation of people came along and says they didn't know God. They didn't know the work that God had done for Israel. They didn't know the stories. God had just been forgotten. All the great things that God did for these people, they were forgotten because obviously the next generation ignored it and did not know God. Do you ever feel like that's happening in America? Think about that as God gets pushed out more and more in different places and evil takes its place in there. Our younger generation is hearing less and less about God. For many of them, it's only when they come to church. Some of them, they get it at home too. So our responsibility is to have our young people in church, to teach them the importance of having a relationship with God, to teach them the importance of having a prayer life where they can talk to God through prayer and reading His Word. Because if we don't, we could be the next to follow in the steps of the Israelites in the book of Judges. They forgot God and instead began to serve false gods of the Canaanites, the ones left in the land. In the 3rd chapter, we read that the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherah. This begins a cycle of sins. The same pattern would be repeated from this point on through Judges. The Israelites would sin. God would no longer help them, no longer be there for them, and then they would do this. This is what we read in Judges 3:9. When the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the sons of Israel to deliver them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. So after they sinned against God and did evil in His sight for a long period of time, and God would finally just basically cut them off, like a parent would do maybe with their child sometimes if they just continue to make bad decisions, they might cut them off and not fund their stuff anymore, not pay for their bills, whatever. But then, after they'd done this to God for so long, God would stop helping them and they would cry out to God. And God would send a deliverer, a judge. The first judge was Othniel, the nephew of Caleb. This is the Caleb that was one of the 12 spies that Moses had sent to spy out the land of Canaan in the book of Numbers. When they came back, if you remember, there were 10 spies that were just terrified. They said, we're too weak, they're too strong, their cities are fortified, their armies are large, they have giants there, we can't defeat them. And it was only two spies, Joshua and Caleb, who had the faith to say, God will deliver us. God will fight for us. But because of the lack of faith, and those 10 got all the Israelites in an uproar, because of the lack of faith, God did not allow these Israelites to enter the promised land. That's why they spent another 40 years there in the desert. Only Joshua and Caleb, from all of that group of the older people, was allowed to enter the promised land. And the first judge would be Caleb's nephew, Othniel. And the land, they tell us, had rest for 40 years, and Othniel died. It was in peace. But what happened next? The sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, it says. And in time they cried out to God. God sent another judge named Ehud. From that moment on, it says, the land was undisturbed. It was peaceful for 80 years. And then they turned to evil again. They cried out to God again, and God sent Shamgar to save Israel as their judge. There's peace again. The 4th chapter of Judges opens this way. Then the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. And the commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. This cycle of sin just keeps happening with these people. It's wash, rinse, repeat, over and over. So God is so fed up with them that He delivers them over to Jabin, the king of Canaan. Now, all this is happening in the first place because they didn't wipe out all of the Canaanites like God had told them to. They already knew, they should have heard that they would start living like them. They would start following their gods. And that's what you see. They did evil in the sight of the Lord again and again and again. So much so here that God gave them over into the hand of Jabin, the king of Canaan. And you can probably guess what the Israelites did next. They cried out to God. This is what we read in Judges 4 through 5. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidot, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah, between Ramah and Bethel, in the hill country of Ephraim. And the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. They cried out. God sends them another deliverer. This time, it's a woman named Deborah. We have a woman with power here. This had not happened before with God's people. Up until this point, God had used men to be the leaders of his people, to make the decisions. And Deborah really becomes one of the most influential women in the Bible, even though we don't read a lot about her. But you see, once again, what we're seeing in this series is God using someone that you would not expect. See, at that time, women weren't really respected when God delivers Deborah. So women weren't really respected, but in Deborah we have a woman of respect. See, Deborah has gained an amazing amount of respect here, obviously, in that day and time. In a day and time, in an age where all the cards were stacked against her because she was just a female. There were several things in this story that we can pull out from it. But if there's one thing that you notice about Deborah that is not printed in the scriptures, is that she has a great deal of self-respect. Even in a day and time that the women were treated this way, she was confident in how God was going to use her. Remember, this is the first woman we read about that God has put in any position of power like this. In a position where she was leading the nation, not just a small group of people, not just her family. And as we're going to see, she stands up for herself to a powerful man named Barak in the 4th chapter. And then she even stands up against the wicked king of Canaan, Jabin. If you really want to earn the respect of others, you begin by respecting yourself. That means doing what's right in God's eyes. So I want to look for a few minutes at just what made Deborah such a woman of respect. And to do that, we're going to look at a couple of roles that she played, that she had for Israel. The first one that you obviously notice in Scripture and see and read about is that Deborah was a judge and prophetess. Deborah served as a judge during a time when the Israelites were oppressed here by the Canaanites. These judges that you can read about in this book of Judges, these judges in ancient Israel, they were leaders raised up by God to deliver his people from oppression and to administer justice, to make the tough decisions. So Deborah had to be known for her wisdom to be able to make these decisions. And the Israelites, they would come to her to settle disputes, to seek her guidance. She even has her own tree, apparently. In the 5th verse that I read, it says that she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah. It was here, we read, that the people of Israel would come to her for her judgment, for tough decisions to be made. It really shows how much she was respected. At that day and time, for men to come to a woman to be judged. There are 12 judges that you read about. She's the only one that is a female. And these judges sought guidance from God. They prayed to God. They meditated before they would proclaim their ruling on a matter, before they would tell them what it was. Many judges were considered to be prophets, and so they would speak words from God. And with her being a female, she's labeled a prophetess. It's the first thing we read about her. It said, now Deborah, a prophetess. Her distinctive role as a prophetess means that she spoke on God's behalf. That's her first role that is mentioned in her. It takes precedence, I guess, over all the other things that she did. She's the only woman who is both prophet and judge, alongside 2 other men in Israel's history, Moses and Samuel. So that tells you what type of company she was in. Her role shows that women were not always inferior to men, since Deborah was called upon by God to deliver Israel. Yet in order to establish her credibility, she's kind of there connected with some leading men. So when she's introduced as well as with her husband in that 4th verse. Her headquarters, as I mentioned, where she would do her job, where she would do her judging, was in the central part of northern Jerusalem. It was under a palm tree of Deborah, between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. The palm tree, it was a symbol of justice. It was this open place nearby there, where a neutral place where people could come to her, be heard, and get judged. Palm trees, they were a symbol of victory, success, triumph, which makes sense when you think about Jesus and his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on the Sunday before he was crucified. When he enters Jerusalem, and the triumphal entry, the crowd cheers for him. They're placing their cloaks on the ground, and they're placing palm branches on the road in front of him as he rides into Jerusalem. Palm branches, palm trees, they were a symbol of victory, success, triumph. They wanted Jesus to be their next king, and they held him as their king that day. Now when it comes to Deborah, not all of her negotiations, I guess, were resolved under a tree. Soon is going to come blood and murder. They're just around the corner. What we see in our next role is that Deborah was a military leader. Once again, not something the Israelites would be familiar with. Not only was she a judge and a prophetess, but she was the leader of Israel's military as well. And that's the famous story that we read about in Judges chapter 4 with her. When it comes to Deborah. After she's introduced to us in those 2 verses, we then read that she summons a man named Deborah, who was the military commander in Israel at the time. So, once again, you kind of see the respect she has. You see her power. She summons not just any guy, but she summons a powerful man, the military commander of Israel's army. Summons him to come to her. And when he comes, she says to him in verses 6 and 7, "Behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand." So she summons him to her. She tells him, this is what God has said you're supposed to do. So Barak says to her, "I'll go." But he adds, "I'm only going to go if you go with me." It's kind of like he's got a little bit of doubt there. She responds that, "I'll go with you." But, she says, however, she points out to him that the honor would not be his for defeating Sisera, who was the commander of the Canaanite army. Instead, God would deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman who would get the honor. So Deborah gets this honor along with another woman that I'm going to mention to you. So if you don't know the story, there's another woman coming into play here. Deborah goes with Barak. At that time, we read that there's a man named Heber. Comes out of nowhere, I guess. A man named Heber. He's a Kenite. And he had left his Kenite people. He had separated himself from those people, and he had pitched his tent far away from them. Well, the battle takes place between Israel's army and the army of Canaan, the king of Canaan. Barak goes down to Mount Tabor, not the high school. He goes down to Mount Tabor. Sisera gets together his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the people who were with him. But Barak, with his 10,000 men, routed Sisera by the hand of God. And Sisera, he takes off and flees on foot, runs for his life. Barak and his men, they pursue the chariots and all of that army, and so they kill all of those men in that army by the sword. Sisera fled away to a tent of a woman named Jael, the wife of that man I mentioned, Heber. Heber and his wife Jael, they had made peace with the king of Canaan, with Jabin. So Jael takes Sisera into their tent. She covers him up. to hide him, gives him something to drink. Sisera tells her to stand outside the tent. That way if anyone comes looking for him, she can kind of lead them in a different direction. And here's what we read happens in verse 21. But Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and seized a hammer in her hand and went secretly to him and drove the peg into his temple. And it went through into the ground, for he was sound asleep and exhausted. So he died. Now this is an evil king. Or this is an evil commander right here of the evil King Jabin. Deborah is not the only wonderful woman in this story, is she? We're focusing on Deborah because she had played such a major role. But Jael also played a major role as a wonderful woman. And after this, Jabin, the king of Canaan, was also destroyed. Deborah, the judge and prophetess, was also a military leader. The 5th chapter of Judges, we're not going to get into it, it contains a song of Deborah. And it's a song that really tells the details of the events that took place in chapter 4. So, Deborah, the woman with power. In a time where women were not considered as equal in many different ways, and in a time where Israel continued to turn away from God over and over and then cry out to God, God would send a deliverer. And God shows us here with Deborah that in his eyes, women are extremely important. Women are necessary. Think about our homes. Things would not go well without the wonderful women who are in there. Think about our congregation. I'll say it, but things would not go well without the wonderful women we have here. Think about this great country we live in. Things would not go well without the wonderful women who are in it. And so sometimes when we act like the Israelites in the book of Judges, sometimes it's our wonderful women who get us back on track. You know, while Deborah didn't get a lot of attention in the Bible, she just gets that 4th chapter and then her song in the 5th chapter. In this one story that we get about her, we learn that she truly is one of the wonderful women in the Bible. I want to thank you for joining us here today. Next week is Mother's Day, and next week we are going to be looking at Rahab on Mother's Day. And so I'm looking forward to that one. But today we saw Deborah, a woman in a day and time, as I've mentioned, that rose to power, a position of power where it was unlikely in that time. Things like that just weren't the norm. But God shows us that he continues to do things in a way that we wouldn't think possible, in a way that we wouldn't even do them. And God is constantly delivering his people. He delivers us from the bondage of sin. If you've never given your life to Jesus Christ, if you've never put your faith in him, if you've never confessed him before people, if you've never repented and willing to place your allegiance in Jesus over everything else, to turn from this way of living to live for God, if you've never been immersed in the waters of baptism, you always have that opportunity to do so. Reach out to us. Let's make it happen if you need to. We're going to sing a hymn of invitation here this morning. Our hymn of invitation is going to be song number 349, standing, if you're able, the first and last verses of I Surrender.